A Chinese fighter jet screams across the sky at 900 kilometers per hour, weapons systems hot, targeting radar locked onto a lone Philippine patrol aircraft. The Filipino pilot's hands grip the controls as his cockpit fills with the piercing shriek of a missile lock warning. He has exactly 4 seconds to make a decision that could start a war. This isn't a film script. This happened 11 days ago, and what the United States deployed in response has brought us closer to World War III than at any moment since the Cuban Missile Crisis. If you think this is just another forgettable territorial dispute in some distant corner of Asia, you're about to discover why 47 million Filipinos are quietly stockpiling food, why American aircraft carriers are running 24-hour combat patrols, and why a fishing accident that killed 2 men has become the spark that could ignite the entire Pacific region. By the end of this video, you'll understand how a collision nobody reported and a jet intercept the media buried for 5 days have fundamentally altered the global balance of power. But before we get to the warships and the weapons systems, let me introduce you to someone whose story will make this crisis painfully real. Maria Santos is 34 years old. She runs a small general store in Masinloc, a fishing village on the Philippine coast that most people couldn't find on a map. For 23 years, her husband Rico has been a fisherman, following the same routes his father taught him, pulling in enough catch to feed their 3 children and keep the store supplied. Every morning at 5 a.m., Rico kisses Maria goodbye and heads to Scarborough Shoal, a horseshoe-shaped reef 120 miles from shore that has sustained their family for 3 generations. On the morning of April 19, 2025, Rico Santos set out at dawn just like always. The weather was perfect, calm seas, clear skies. His wooden boat, the Santa Maria, carried a crew of 5 men, all neighbors from the village. By 6:30 a.m., they had reached their usual fishing spot, nets ready, hoping for a good haul. At exactly 6:47 a.m., everything changed. A Chinese Coast Guard vessel, measuring 165 meters in length and displacing 12,000 tons, appeared on the horizon. These aren't patrol boats. They're floating fortresses, equipped with water cannons powerful enough to shred fishing nets and capsize small vessels. Rico's boat weighs 8 tons. Do the mathematics. The Chinese vessel cut directly across the Santa Maria's path at full speed. Rico shouted warnings, his crew grabbed whatever they could hold onto, but the impact was inevitable. The sound of wood splintering echoed across the water. Cold seawater rushed through the hull breach. 2 of Rico's crew members were thrown against the bulkhead, ribs cracking on impact. One man, 52-year-old Ernesto Lopez, suffered internal bleeding so severe he's still in intensive care 3 weeks later. The Chinese vessel didn't stop. It didn't offer assistance. It simply continued its patrol route as if nothing had happened. The Santa Maria limped back to port, half submerged, its crew traumatized and injured. Maria received the phone call at 9:15 a.m. Her husband was alive, but their livelihood was destroyed. The boat her grandfather built by hand was beyond repair. But here's what will make your blood run cold. This collision wasn't reported on any news channel. It didn't appear in any international incident log. According to leaked documents from the Philippine Navy, this was the 7th unreported collision in just 3 months. A 2024 study by the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative documented a 340% increase in what they diplomatically call aggressive maneuvers by Chinese Coast Guard vessels since January 2023. These aren't accidents. They're a calculated strategy of intimidation designed to drive Filipino fishermen away from waters they've fished for centuries. But the jet intercept that happened 11 days ago wasn't about fishing rights or territorial pride. It was about something buried 200 meters beneath those contested waves, something worth killing for. This story is about to get significantly darker, and if you want to understand how close we actually are to military conflict, you need to subscribe right now. What the United States just deployed into these waters will shock you, and YouTube's algorithm won't show you the second part of this investigation unless you hit that button. Do it now, because the truth I'm about to reveal has been deliberately hidden from you. Let's talk about what's really beneath those waves that China is willing to risk war to control. In 2023, the United States Geological Survey released a report that barely made headlines but should have dominated every news cycle for weeks. Their assessment of the South China Sea revealed deposits of approximately 11 billion barrels of oil and 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. To put that in perspective, we're talking about 7.5 trillion pound worth of energy resources, enough to power India and Indonesia combined for 4 decades. But the real prize isn't the oil. It's what geologists discovered in 2024. Rare earth elements. These are materials with names most people can't pronounce but which are absolutely essential for modern technology. Neodymium for smartphone screens. Terbium for missile guidance systems. Lanthanum for electric vehicle batteries. The South China Sea contains deposits worth an estimated 890 billion pounds, and China currently controls 70% of global rare earth production. If they secure the South China Sea deposits, that control increases to 95%. Every electric car, every smartphone, every advanced weapon system on Earth would depend on Chinese goodwill. This is why China drew their infamous 9-dash line on maps, claiming 90% of the South China Sea as sovereign territory. Never mind that international law, specifically the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, says they have no legal claim to these waters. Never mind that in 2016, the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague unanimously ruled China's claims invalid. Beijing's position is simple. Historical maps from the Han Dynasty give them rights that supersede modern international law. It's historical fiction dressed up as foreign policy, but when you're the world's second-largest military power, you can afford to ignore inconvenient legal rulings. Here's what changed the entire calculation. On March 27, 2025, Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. quietly signed Executive Order 847. Buried in the bureaucratic language was a provision allowing joint exploration agreements with American energy firms in the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. Translation: U.S. companies could now drill for oil and rare earth elements in the exact waters China considers their property. The deal was signed in private. No press conference, no announcement. But within 72 hours, Chinese intelligence knew every detail. The jet intercept happened exactly 11 days later. Coincidence? Not according to Admiral Samuel Papineau, commander of United States Indo-Pacific Command, who told a closed-door congressional hearing in April 2025, and I'm quoting leaked testimony here, "We are one miscalculation away from kinetic conflict." The South China Sea has become the most dangerous body of water on Earth. China's response to that executive order wasn't diplomatic protests or UN complaints. It was 40,000 tons of gray steel cutting through international waters at 30 knots, battle systems armed and ready. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen is 36 years old, a tactical officer aboard the USS Carl Vinson. She joined the Navy 14 years ago, worked her way up through destroyer commands and intelligence postings, married a Filipino-American software engineer, and has family still living in Manila. At 3 a.m. on May 1, 2025, she received deployment orders that made her hands shake. Her husband called it the phone call every military family dreads. The USS Carl Vinson isn't just another warship. It's a floating city. A Nimitz-class supercarrier displacing 100,000 tons, powered by 2 nuclear reactors that give it effectively unlimited range. It carries 90 aircraft, from F/A-18 Super Hornets to E-2 Hawkeye surveillance planes. Its crew of 7,500 personnel includes everyone from fighter pilots to nuclear engineers. When a carrier strike group deploys, it brings destroyers, cruisers, submarines, and supply ships. The entire package represents more firepower than most nations' entire militaries. The Carl Vinson Strike Group was ordered to position itself 180 nautical miles from Scarborough Shoal. For context, that's the closest permanent American carrier presence in 14 months. Every previous deployment has stayed at least 300 miles distant. This positioning puts U.S. fighter jets exactly 7 minutes flight time from the contested waters. Sarah Chen knew what that meant. Her Combat Information Center would be tracking Chinese vessels 24 hours a day. One wrong move by either side, one trigger-happy pilot, one miscommunication, and she'd be fighting a war. But here's what the media isn't reporting, what even most military analysts have missed. The Carl Vinson wasn't the only deployment. 2 Virginia-class submarines, the most advanced attack submarines in the world, silently took up positions in the South China Sea. Their exact locations remain classified, but Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force sources confirmed their presence through underwater acoustic monitoring. These submarines carry Tomahawk cruise missiles with 1,600-kilometer range. They can strike Beijing from their current positions. The technological advantage these vessels represent is staggering. The Carl Vinson's and Spy 6 radar system can simultaneously track over 1,000 targets and detect fighter aircraft at ranges exceeding 400 miles. It can see threats before Chinese systems even know American planes have taken off. But China didn't sit idle while the US positioned its pieces on the chessboard. Within 48 hours of the Carl Vinson's arrival, China deployed 3 Type 055 destroyers to shadow the American carrier group. These aren't ordinary warships. Military analysts consider them the most advanced surface combatants currently operational, superior in some respects to America's Arleigh Burke-class destroyers. They carry 112 vertical launch cells that can fire anti-ship missiles, land attack cruise missiles, or surface-to-air missiles. Their integrated radar systems can track American submarines and coordinate with Chinese aircraft in ways that would have been impossible 5 years ago. The current situation, the closest Chinese and American warships are operating just 12 miles apart. For comparison, during the 1996 Taiwan Strait crisis, the minimum separation was 30 miles, and that confrontation brought us within hours of military engagement. We're now operating at less than half that distance, with more advanced weapons, shorter response times, and a media environment that amplifies every incident into an international crisis. But the real game changer, the move that has Pentagon strategists genuinely worried, wasn't the warship deployments. It was a phone call that happened in a Manila hotel room at midnight, a conversation that fundamentally altered the strategic balance in Asia. The meeting took place on April 15, 2025. No media was present, no photographers, no press releases. Japan's defense minister and the Philippines' Secretary of National Defense sat down in a conference room at the Makati Shangri-La Hotel. What they signed that night will be studied in military academies for decades. The Reciprocal Access Agreement allows Japanese self-defense forces to operate from Philippine military bases for the first time since World War II ended 80 years ago. Read that sentence again and let the historical weight sink in. Japan, which occupied the Philippines during the war, whose military committed atrocities that Filipinos haven't forgotten, whose constitution specifically prohibits offensive military operations, now has permanent basing rights in the Philippines. The practical implications are staggering. Japan has pledged 6 advanced Coast Guard vessels, P-1 maritime patrol aircraft with some of the world's most sophisticated submarine hunting technology, and £1.2 billion in what they diplomatically call capability enhancement funding. Translation: weapons, radar systems, and training that will transform the Philippine military from a coastal defense force into a regional power. But here's why this absolutely terrifies Beijing. Geography is destiny in military affairs. Philippine bases put Japanese forces 600 miles closer to Taiwan than their primary staging grounds in Okinawa. If China ever attempts to invade Taiwan, and U.S. intelligence estimates that possibility at 40% probability by 2027, Japanese forces could now strike from Philippine territory, complicating Chinese invasion plans in ways Beijing never anticipated. The domino effect happened faster than anyone predicted. Within 48 hours of the Japan-Philippines agreement becoming public, Australia announced rotational deployments to Philippine bases. Not permanent stationing, mind you, but military units on continuous rotation, which amounts to the same thing. Australian P-8 Poseidon aircraft, considered the world's premier submarine hunters, now operate from Clark Air Base, the former U.S. installation that Americans vacated in 1991. India quietly joined the party in late April with a defense cooperation agreement that includes real-time information sharing on Chinese naval movements in the Indian Ocean and South China Sea. This matters because Indian surveillance assets cover the western approaches to the South China Sea, the routes Chinese oil tankers must transit. If conflict erupts, India could strangle China's energy supplies without firing a shot. We're witnessing the spontaneous formation of a coalition nobody predicted. The AUKUS framework, originally just Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States, now informally includes Japan and the Philippines. Dr. Rory Medcalf, head of the National Security College at Australian National University, published an analysis in April 2025 with a title that says everything: the fastest military realignment in Indo-Pacific history. The economic implications are just as significant as the military ones. The combined GDP of this informal alliance, US, Japan, Australia, India, Philippines, reaches £28 trillion. China's GDP is £14 trillion. In any sustained conflict, China faces opponents with twice their economic capacity. Beijing's strategists understand this mathematics perfectly, which is why their response targeted the one domain where this coalition is genuinely vulnerable. China's retaliation was immediate, brutal, and struck at the weakest point in the alliance's armor, the digital infrastructure that modern societies cannot function without. Elena Rodriguez is 29 years old, an IT manager at Philippine General Hospital in Manila, one of the largest medical facilities in Southeast Asia. She arrived at work on the morning of April 23, 2025, to find chaos. Every computer screen displayed the same message: encrypted files, payment demanded in yuan, 72 hours to comply or all data would be permanently destroyed. Patient records, surgical schedules, prescription databases, all inaccessible. This wasn't an isolated incident. That same morning, 47 separate Philippine government systems were hit simultaneously with ransomware attacks. The Port of Manila's operations system went down for 11 hours, creating a backlog that cost £340 million in disrupted trade. Immigration databases were locked. Tax records encrypted. Even the traffic management system for Metro Manila crashed, creating gridlock that lasted 3 days. Mandiant Threat Intelligence, the cybersecurity division of Google, traced the attack signatures to APT40, a Chinese state-sponsored hacking group that had been quiet for 18 months. The sophistication of the operation suggested months of preparation. These systems weren't just attacked, they had been infiltrated long ago, with malware lying dormant until activated on command. The message was clear: China could paralyze Philippine society without firing a single shot. But the pattern extended far beyond the Philippines. Within 72 hours, similar attacks struck Australian energy grids, causing rolling blackouts across Queensland. Japanese railway systems experienced technical difficulties that disrupted 2.3 million commuters. Indian financial networks faced distributed denial-of-service attacks that temporarily froze 40% of digital payment systems. The coordination was impossible to miss. Here's the terrifying part: most governments suppressed information about these attacks to avoid public panic. The full scope of the cyber warfare campaign remains classified, but leaked National Security Council documents suggest the attacks were 10 times more extensive than publicly acknowledged. Critical infrastructure across the alliance was penetrated. Power grids, water treatment facilities, telecommunications networks, all potentially compromised. A 2024 study by MIT Technology Review found that ASEAN nations' critical infrastructure is 67% more susceptible to Chinese cyber attacks than NATO countries, simply because investment in cybersecurity has lagged decades behind infrastructure development. When you're rushing to build smart cities and digital economies, security often comes second. China has been exploiting that vulnerability systematically. The retaliation nobody saw coming happened at 3 a.m. on April 28, 2025. U.S. Cyber Command, coordinating with Australian, Japanese, and Indian counterparts, launched a counter-operation that took down over 200 Chinese surveillance nodes scattered across the South China Sea. These weren't just cameras and radar stations. They were sophisticated intelligence-gathering systems built into artificial islands, oil platforms, and even underwater cables. The technological revelation that emerged from this operation should terrify anyone who understands its implications. China has been tapping underwater fiber optic cables that carry 95% of intercontinental internet traffic and virtually all secure military communications. Every email, every phone call, every encrypted message transmitted across the Pacific has potentially been compromised for years. The scale of the intelligence breach remains classified, but former NSA officials are calling it worse than Snowden. A UN cybersecurity expert, speaking anonymously because his assessment is so alarming, estimated that a digital Pearl Harbor scenario, where cyberattacks cause mass casualties by disabling life support systems, power grids, and emergency services simultaneously, now has a 40% probability within the next 18 months. We're not talking about theoretical risks anymore. We're talking about documented capabilities that have already been deployed in limited operations. While hackers battled in the digital realm, something happened on the water that brought conventional military forces to within seconds of opening fire. May 2, 2025, 2:47 p.m. local time. A Philippine FA-50 fighter jet, a light combat aircraft purchased from South Korea, is conducting a routine patrol 90 miles from Scarborough Shoal. The pilot, whose identity remains classified for security reasons, is maintaining standard altitude and course when his radar warning receiver suddenly shrieks an alert that every combat pilot dreads. Missile lock. A Chinese J-11 fighter, a fourth-generation air superiority aircraft roughly equivalent to an American F-15, has activated its weapons radar and locked onto the Philippine plane. In fighter pilot terminology, this is called painting a target. It's the step immediately before launching missiles. The Filipino pilot has seconds to react. His testimony, delivered in a classified debriefing but leaked to press sources, is chilling. I heard the tone. Every pilot knows that sound. It's the sound of imminent death. You have seconds to react or you're dead. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I broke hard right and dove 3,000 feet. My airframe was screaming, pulling GS that pushed the plane to its structural limits. I could feel the wings flexing. Another second of hesitation and I wouldn't be giving this statement. The Philippine fighter escaped the lock, but the incident triggered immediate escalation. The FA-50 pilot transmitted an emergency signal that reached the USS Carl Vinson's Combat Information Center within seconds. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chin, our tactical officer, watched her displays light up with threat indicators. The decision tree was simple. A U.S. treaty ally had just been threatened with lethal force. The Mutual Defense Treaty signed in 1951 obligates America to respond to attacks on Philippine forces as if they were attacks on U.S. forces. 4 F-35 Lightning II fighters launched from the Carl Vinson within 6 minutes. These aren't ordinary aircraft. They're fifth-generation stealth fighters invisible to most radar systems, equipped with sensors that can track enemy aircraft from hundreds of miles away while remaining undetected. They can fire missiles from ranges where enemy pilots don't even know they're under attack. They reached the intercept coordinates in 11 minutes. What happened next was the closest aerial confrontation between American and Chinese fighters since the Cold War. The Chinese J-11 was joined by 3 additional fighters launched from Chinese bases in the Spratly Islands. The American F-35s took up defensive positions around the Philippine aircraft. 4:47 minutes, 8 fighters circled each other in a deadly aerial ballet, weapons armed, targeting systems active, pilots waiting for orders to engage. Intercepted radio communications, leaked by intelligence sources, revealed just how close this came to combat. The Chinese flight leader received orders to maintain aggressive posture and do not yield position. The American flight leader was ordered to mirror Chinese movements but do not escalate beyond defensive positioning. Both sides claimed they were responding to provocations. Both sides insisted they were acting defensively. Both sides had their fingers hovering over weapon release buttons. The standoff ended because of something prosaic: fuel. Fighter jets burn enormous quantities of fuel during high-stress maneuvers. After 47 minutes of tight turns and aggressive positioning, both Chinese and American flights were reaching their fuel minimums. They had to return to base or risk running out of fuel over open ocean. The disengagement was simultaneous, carefully choreographed over emergency military frequencies to avoid either side interpreting withdrawal as an attack opportunity. Both sides declared victory. Chinese state media ran footage of their fighters, defending sovereign airspace from foreign provocateurs. American officials briefed Congress that F-35s had successfully deterred hostile action against a treaty ally. The Philippine pilot who started it all simply said he was grateful to be alive. But here's what changed in the aftermath. Within 24 hours, an emergency hotline was established between U.S. Indo-Pacific Command Headquarters in Hawaii and China's Southern Theater Command Headquarters in Guangzhou. It's essentially a crisis hotline, like the one established between Washington and Moscow after the Cuban Missile Crisis, designed to prevent misunderstandings from escalating into warfare. Admiral John Aquilino, who was then serving as commander of U.S. Pacific Fleet before his recent retirement, gave a speech at the Naval War College 3 weeks ago. One line has been quoted repeatedly in defense circles. What happened on May 2nd was not a near miss. It was a dry run. Both sides tested response times, communication procedures, and operational capabilities. We now know exactly how fast the situation can spiral out of control. The answer is, too fast for diplomacy to catch up. The choice facing policymakers is stark. Either achieve a diplomatic breakthrough that de-escalates tensions, or accept that military confrontation is inevitable. The middle ground is collapsing. Every incident pushes both sides closer to a threshold where de-escalation becomes impossible. So let's talk about what's actually at stake here, because this isn't an abstract geopolitical chess match. This is about real human consequences that could reshape life for billions of people. Right now, at this very moment, 3 nuclear powers are operating warships within a 200-mile radius. The United States has approximately 5,400 nuclear warheads. China has an estimated 500, though that number is growing rapidly. India, which has moved naval assets into the Bay of Bengal to monitor Chinese movements, has roughly 170 nuclear weapons. We're talking about enough destructive power to end human civilization concentrated in one small patch of ocean. The human dimension is staggering. There are 4.7 million Filipino overseas workers, people like Rico Santos who send money home to support families. They're spread across dozens of countries, but the highest concentration is in Middle Eastern nations that depend on shipping routes through the South China Sea. If conflict closes those shipping lanes, Filipino workers can't get home. Families can't reunite. Remittances that represent 10% of the Philippine GDP suddenly stop flowing. The economic domino effect is almost impossible to comprehend. 30% of global maritime trade passes through the South China Sea. That's 15 trillion pounds in annual commerce. Container ships carrying electronics from China to Europe. Oil tankers moving Middle Eastern petroleum to Asian markets. Bulk carriers transporting Australian iron ore to Japanese steel mills. If shooting starts, insurance companies will declare the region a war zone. Shipping costs will increase tenfold overnight. Supply chains that took decades to build will collapse in weeks. Your smartphone probably contains components that transited the South China Sea at least 3 times during manufacturing. The lithium battery was mined in Australia, shipped to China for processing, then sent to Vietnam for assembly into battery packs, then returned to China for final integration into phones, then shipped globally for sale. If that route is blocked, global smartphone production stops within 30 days. The same applies to laptops, televisions, automobiles, medical equipment, basically everything manufactured in Asia. Here's the question nobody in Washington wants to ask publicly, but which is being debated furiously in classified strategy sessions. If a Chinese fighter jet fires on a Philippine aircraft and kills the pilot, does the U.S. Mutual Defense Treaty mean automatic war? The treaty language is clear. An armed attack on Philippine forces in the Pacific triggers American military response. But armed attack is subject to interpretation. Is a radar lock an attack? Is ramming a fishing boat an attack? Where exactly is the line? Historical parallels are instructive here, but also terrifying. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, seemed like a tragic but localized incident. Within 5 weeks, every major European power was at war. Within 4 years, 20 million people were dead. The mechanisms of alliance systems, military mobilization schedules, and nationalist fervor transformed a single murder into a continental catastrophe. We're now operating in an environment with similarly complex alliance structures, faster communication, more destructive weapons, and leaders facing intense domestic political pressure to appear strong. The ingredients for catastrophic escalation are all present. The only missing element is the spark, and we've just witnessed multiple near sparks in the past 3 weeks. So here's my question for you, and I genuinely want to know your answer. Should the United States risk nuclear war over fishing rights and oil deposits that aren't even on American territory? Or should the Philippines negotiate directly with China, accept some compromise on territorial claims, and avoid dragging the world into conflict? Your answer reveals everything about your worldview, about whether you prioritize sovereignty over safety, principles over pragmatism, standing with allies over avoiding catastrophe. Comment your thoughts right now because this is the defining geopolitical question of our generation. And hit that subscribe button because this situation is developing by the hour. The simulations show 3 distinct paths this crisis could take, and 2 of them end in scenarios you don't want to imagine. Don't miss it, because understanding what comes next might be the most important thing you learn this year.